this extra bi-week stuff, and we can take off the toString and copy this, or actually cut it, and say equals. And score is a, what kind of value? A double. So we'd say double dot parse and our text value. Now again, if the user decides, I'm going to be funny and put something like fail in the score box, that will blow up. So we'll come back through error handling and address that. But that's something to think about. Whenever a user gives you information, you need to check it first. So in fact, you know what? I'm just so concerned about the user, I'm actually going to pull this out into its another method, bool parse or score valid equals double dot try parse. There's our string, and we have out, and this is the result. Let's say score val. And we'll say double score val equals 0. There is a better way of doing this in 2017, Visual Studio 2017, with C#7. They allow you to actually declare this in line. So you'd say out int score, or out double score val. So that's a nice new feature of C#7. If you catch my video on YouTube, I'll have one on the things I like and don't like about C# 7.0, as well as one on Visual Studio itself. So I'll have those up soon, if I don't already, by the time you're watching this. But definitely check those out for the new stuff, if you can use it. But for now, we'll still do this. It's not that much more. And then down here, we will wrap this in an if statement, surround with if score valid. Else, and this is the problem area, we could do m.entries 0.score equals 0, or we could do nothing at all. I kind of like not doing anything at all, because then they're not actually modifying anything. So let's just do a message box.show. Please enter a valid score for team 1. You know it's team 1. And I'm going to do a return. And the reason I'm doing return is because I don't want them to continue. I don't want them to actually move on to the next one and put a score in there, modify a score, because they've already broken something. So let's actually do that. That'll exit out of the entire method. So we don't need to set this information. And then we'll do the same thing down here, where we'll actually grab this same code. In fact, let's copy the entire thing. We don't need the else. I'm going to paste it right above the code. And we have to make all the different changes to this. So score 2 value, team 2 score value, team 2 score value. And we don't need a double parse. Sorry about that. There we go. If the score is valid, we've already parsed it in the score val variable. Makes our code a little bit cleaner. So now we should have everything except for that, which we just changed. And now we can modify or take this out. And we don't need to change the text for the team name, so we'll take that out as well. So now what happens is when you click the score button, it should update the team with the correct values. Now, we're not done yet. Let's go after this for loop. So after we've looped through both the first and the second team, and we haven't returned early because they put a bad value in, we should be able to say, and let's actually capture these values outside of our if statement. So I actually say double team1 score equals 0, double team2 score equals 0. And so I'll actually replace this. I'll do the same thing down here. I'll actually replace it. Remember that anything inside of the curly braces lives in that scope. So any of my variables live inside that scope and they die at the end of those same curly braces. Therefore, I don't have access to those variables outside of the scope of this if statement. Therefore, in order to access them, I have to create the variables outside the scope. In this case, I created the variables in the scope of the event method. That way I can have access to them throughout the event. And the reason why is this. I'm going to say if team1 score is greater than team2 score, that means team1 wins. So if team1 wins, we need to take that team entry and put it into our matchup as the winner. So we'd say m.winner equals m.entries 0 dot team competing. So we'll take the team that's competing and mark that as the winner of our matchup. Now this winner is no longer null, which that's what we're checking for when we display or not display the items based upon if we allow completed ones to show up. So we've taken matchup entry 0. Now how do I know that's a valid spot? We don't want a out of bounds error in my array. I know that's valid because I know that I have two working scores, team 1 and team 2, because we went through that. Now, if I only have a team 1, guess what? I will still mark team 1 as the winner because they really are. For example, if team 1 is Tim's team and team 2 is actually the bye, we only have one team. Therefore, team 1, the score, if it's greater than 0, is the winner. Now, this does raise the issue of high score versus low score for the winner. And if you want to support the idea of, for example, golf, where the low score wins, then what you'd have to do is reverse this greater than to a less than. If you want to support both, we'll have to have a setting in our application somewhere where we say it's high score wins or low score wins. And then you do either wrap this in another if statement that says if high score wins, do this one, else do the other one, or something like that. And you can store that information in your app.config if you want, or you could store it in your database. But for now, we're going to say that high score wins. So if team 1 score is greater than team 2 score, team 1 score is the winner. And this is where the else is kind of tricky, because what if they're tied? In this case, if I just do an else and it's a tie, tie will always go to team 2. Now, we probably shouldn't have a tie, but if we did, what would we do? So I'm going to say else if, and say team 2 score is greater than team 1 score. Oops. And then I'll do m.winner equals m.entries 1 team competing. And I'm going to leave off, or I'll actually tell them else message box dot show I do not handle tie games. So I'm not going to mark a winner. I won't say who won. I'll just say that they're even as of right now. And that's it. So there's our logic for marking who won and who didn't. And now they're based upon which one is scored. Let's see if this works first, and then we'll get into how we handle saving this information to the database and some other considerations. So we're going to load our first tourney. And we have the uncanny losers. Let's give them a score of 5. And we have to deal with this because normally we shouldn't even see this because they should be marked as 1 already. So we should already have them either put a 1 in here or something like that and just have it marked as winner. But let's mark there as a winner and see what happens. Nothing seems to have changed, but we come back to it. 5 is in that box again. That's good. If we uncheck the unplayed only, notice we only have 1 team now because Uncanny Losers has completed their round. Now if we mark Sue's team as having 10 and score that, in theory, we have a problem. And the reason we have a problem is because I checked the unplayed only, and we have no entries for unplayed only. And this raises a bug in our code. And it says sequence contains no elements. So I had said load matchup, get the first one. Well, we can't do that because there is no first one in an empty list. So let's solve this problem by saying surround with if selected matchups dot count is greater than 0. Now it runs just fine. Now it didn't clear out this list, which we got to work on that, but for now at least this works. Now here's what I do when I spot a bug like this where I still have values over here. First of all, I say, is this really a bug or is it just something we can live with and not worry about? And if it's a bug where I say, nope, I really can't live with that, then what I do is I write it down on a piece of paper somewhere, and I find paper is much better for this than trying to put it in electronic format, just because electronic format tends to draw me away from what I'm doing, and I get sucked into other things, especially web-based stuff. Because web-based stuff, you're there, you're putting your stuff in, and all of a sudden you realize, hey, I've got a new email, and I click on that. Or, you open up my new tab for my Chrome browser, gives me the day's headlines at the bottom, the popular Bing searches. And it gives me my 6 or 8 popular websites to go to, the ones I go to all the time. Well, that's distracting. So I'll end up going to 3 or 4 of those websites and looking at a couple of news stories, and that takes down a path. And so that electronic tool, which is supposed to save me time, ends up costing me 10, 15 minutes of distraction. So I'll usually write down a piece of paper there's a bug here where nothing in the matchup list and the last selected team is still available or still viewable. So I'd probably clear that out. We also have to address the idea of if this list is blank, should we even see any of this stuff? And the answer is probably no. So before we go any further, let's actually deal with this bug. I wouldn't recommend doing this in real life. And I hesitate to even do it here because I don't want to show you things that you really shouldn't do. So but I do want to address it, but I also don't want to lose a thread of where we're at. And right now, under the score button, which has way too much code right in the event, we should create at least one method for this. I don't want to lose the fact that we're not done yet in this. We have to actually save this information to the database or to the text file. So I do want to address that as well. But this is a pretty simple fix. And so let's actually address this right away. So I'm going to pin my, actually going to stop it first. I'm going to look at my properties. Again, if you come up here, all right, there we go. It's this icon right here where my mouse is, and it's the property window. Right now we're in the events window, or events section of our property window. So I'm going to go to properties, and I want to see the names of these fields. So text one name, I'm sorry, team one name, team one score label, team one score value. So I'm assuming these are the same. So if I remember team one and team two, I can get 6 of these right away. So let's go look at where the matchups are actually shown. Load matchups. What we're going to do here is we're going to say display matchup info. And that's it. We're going to call this method called display private void display matchup info. And we're going to say if selected matchups dot count is greater than 0, so we do have something to show. If we do, then team one name dot visible equals true. And actually, we can make this a little bit easier. Let's say bool is visible equals, and check this out. I keep the parens. Do I like parens around things when I'm assigning them? Now, what did I just do there? This is called a shortcut, and I'm not always a huge fan of shortcuts, and if it all confuses you, don't do it. What I'm saying here is this right here, it was the heart of my if statement. This is the part that evaluates the true or false. And based upon that true or false, I do something. I'm taking that and capturing the result of it instead of doing some kind of action on it. So I'm saying, here's the evaluation, store that in a Boolean. I could make this back into an if statement, and if this was true, set is visible equal true, and if it's false, set is visible equal to false. But I could just take this value and put it right into is visible. But now I can say team one name dot visible equals is visible. Do you see why it's better? Because now I don't have to specify team one name dot visible twice. Once for true, once for false. Now I just do it based upon this Boolean variable. I'm just setting all the values to the same Boolean. Okay, team 2 score label and team 2 score value. And now I have to grab those couple others. This one right here is versus label, and it's a score button. So is visible and score button dot visible equals is visible. So now every time we load the matchups, we're going to run this check. And this check says if we have values in our selected matchups, then we set everything to visible. That's going to be true. If we don't have values in our matchups, set everything to invisible or false. Let's see this in action. So load tourney. I will mark this as scored. Let's do our check versus uncheck. Notice it did not refresh this to take it out of the list. But now notice my score information is gone. Now it's back. Now it's gone. And that's based upon whether or not we have values in our list box. So that's good. But now we have to also take it out of the list if this is checked and we've scored it. And that's actually not too hard to do. So let's go ahead and do that right away. So the way to do this is to come down and look at our event for the unplayed only checkbox underscore check changed. All we do is call the load matchups again. So let's select that and let's actually run that in the score button at the very end. Now what this is going to do, I'm going to run this. What it's going to do is every time we change a value and hit score, it'll refresh this list. And there we go. Now it responds more like we expected it to. And if we score this, it even takes it all the way away. So that's great. That's exactly what we wanted. Now, let's put a tie in here. And we don't handle tie games. So, everything is working like it should. The only thing we have not yet done is whenever this button is clicked, we want to store this in the database or text file. And that's actually not that hard to do. So let's look back at our score button click. And we're going to need to clean this up and take it out of the button underscore click event and do it more like this. So we're going to need to do that in a minute. But for now, what I want to do is actually complete the action. And then we'll look at how to actually extract it out. And I may save that for our video on refactoring. Because refactoring is an important part of an application. But if you see something when you first create it, definitely do it then. But there's a lot of times when you come to an application where you're like, oh, that could be done so much better. And so it is a good idea to also learn how to refactor. So that may be one that it's not contrived necessarily. I don't want to do anything contrived. But it is something where I could refactor it now, or I could come back to it and refactor. And for the sake of demonstration, I think I'll come back to it and refactor. All right, so before we go any further, let's figure out how to save the information. Now, if we come over here to our Solution Explorer, we have the iData connection, where we create items, create tournament, create team, create person, create prize, and we get items. Let's create a new type. I'm going to put a little bit of spacing here. We're going to say void update matchup. Matchup model. Model. Now, why no return type? Well, because if we work on an object, then anything we do gets passed back to the caller because, again, it's just that address. But also, we're just updating. We're just saying, take the information that I already have and put it in the database so I can get it back next time I call the database. So let's go to SQL. I believe we're actually in SQL right now, but I can check. Yep, we're in SQL right now, so let's start with SQL. And it yells at us about not having implemented the contract fully. So we can do our control dot or do the drop down and say implement interface. And then find that entry. Got a lot of code in here now. So what are we going to do to update our matchup? Well, it's actually a couple things we need to do. One is we need to store the matchup, and two is we need to store the matchup entries. Now let's go to our SQL first. We'll start there. And let's look at, we have matchup entries insert, but we do not have matchup entries where we're actually doing work on it. Now let's also look at what matchup entries has in it. Let's do a select star from matchup first, matchups, and then also a select star from matchup entries. So matchups has a tournament ID, the actual ID itself, the winner, and the matchup round. And the winner is the winner ID. So all we need to do to update the matchups is pass in the ID of the winner. For the matchup entries, we need to pass in the scores, and that's it. Because all the rest of the stuff is already taken care of. Now, the one thing that we may need to change, and we'll need to address this in a little bit, is the idea of the team competing ID, because that will change as well. We don't want to create two different store procedures if we don't have to. So let's also work on changing that. And this is a question you have to address. There is another way of doing this, which would be to create two store procedures. One to update a score, one to update the team competing ID. And then they're specialized for exactly what you want them. Or you can create one that does both. I think we're just going to create the one for this. I don't really think we need to have two separate ones to do almost the same thing. It's just a little bit less to maintain in our SQL list here. So let's create a new store procedure. We'll start with matchups. I'll actually span out the columns for this and for matchup entries. So let's get rid of the top stuff. And we're going to say DBO dot SP matchup matchups underscore update. We're going to pass in at ID int. Now it's not an output, it's an input this time. So the at ID and the at winner ID. And that's all we're going to update. We're not going to allow them to move matchups to a different round. We're not going to allow them to move a matchup to a different tournament. So therefore, we only need these two values. So now we can say update dbo.matchups set winner ID equals at winner ID, where ID equals at ID. It's very important, and I cover this in my SQL course, but it's very important that you have this where clause. If you don't, if you forget and just have this, guess what happens? Every record has the winner ID set to whatever you passed in. Every record. That's a real bummer when you have production data. It's still a bummer when you have test data because you just wiped out all that information. It's really a bummer if you don't have a good backup. So be careful of that. Inserts, you can't do a ton of damage with an insert. Updates, you can do an awful lot of damage. So just be careful to have all of that and don't accidentally select just this and hit execute. Because again, if something is highlighted, only that code gets run. So let's create this procedure. And now we have our procedure. It takes just ID and winner ID. Let's go to our code. And I will write this in a comment. And now we can copy the code for a less complex example of a write. Here's a pretty simple one. I'll just copy this and use this as a pattern to get started. So it'd be at ID and at winner ID. No output. The first one is the matchup or model.id, that's right. And the second one is the model.winner.id. So we need to also create that connection. The one I copied from had the connection passed in. So I have to create that. Notice how Visual Studio cleaned up my code for me and formatted it nicely. That was very nice of them. Makes our lives a little bit easier. So let's pass in the correct store procedure name. And that should be it. So now we've updated our matchup. But we're not done there. Back over in SQL, we have to create another stored procedure. And this time it's for matchup entries. And so we're going to pass in the ID. And then we're going to pass in the team competing ID. Int. And we'll say equals 0. That allows us to say, well, if we don't know the team competing, we don't have to pass that value in. If we don't pass it in, the default is 0. So the other thing we update is the score. And we'll also put that as a 0. Oops, int 0. And actually, it's not an integer, it's a float. There we go. That's better. So now we can pass in the ID. We have to pass in the ID. And then we can optionally pass in the team competing ID or the score, or both. Now, neither would still work, but that's kind of stupid. So what this would do is if we're updating a score, we just pass a score in. If we now know who's competing in this matchup entry, we pass in just the team competing ID. And that takes care of updating this record. And actually, now that I look at it, we also allow nulls. So let's actually put it to null instead of 0. Remember I said that a score of 0 is actually a valid score? So let's do that. So now we can say update dbo.matchupEntries set team competing ID equals at team competing ID, comma, score equals at score, where ID equals at ID. So now I'm updating two values, the team competing ID and the score. If we don't pass in one of the values, it will be set to null. All right, so let's grab this. So we have ID, team competing ID, and score. All right, so there's our store procedure. There's our 3 parameters. And that's just my notes so I don't forget what to put in each section. Now we will do a copy of this and do a for each. For each, and I start with the collection first. Usually, it just makes it a little easier to fill in what the name is going to be. So we're going to say model dot entries. So this will be a matchup entry model. We'll call it ME. There's our code for calling the store procedure. I'll need to update all these values. ID is correct. The team competing. Actually, the ID is not correct. That would be me.id. The team competing is me.teamcompeting.id. And the winner is, it's not a winner, it's a score. I hate when it does that. Score, there we go. The reason it did that is because I double clicked on here, I was going to hit Control V. The problem was that I was getting too fast and I hit Control click. And that brought up this peek at the definition for string. Which, okay, it's kind of cool. If I'm a Control click here, it will bring up the definition of model or matchup entry model. And I can look through it. That's kind of neat. But I often get in too much of a hurry, trying to go too fast, and double click and paste at the same time, and that makes me do that. So that's why it happens. It's a nice feature to have, but it also can get in my way once in a while. Okay, so we going to change the value for score to be me.score. Now, we're passing in all 3 values here, but this one right here could be a problem. Because if we don't have a team competing yet, then we would have an error. Now we should have a team competing by now, because if we're saving a matchup and updating it, we're either updating it to add the team or we're updating it to say what the new score is. But if we have a new score, that means it already has a team. So in theory, this should never crash. And if it does crash, that means that we're trying to set the score for an entry that doesn't have a team. And that doesn't seem to work for me. Now, we have the bye week, but we don't really set a score for bye week because we don't have a place to put the score. So that wouldn't cause a problem. So here's my thought on this. This should be one of those times when the application crashes, because we have some sort of malformed data in here, and we definitely don't want to store that then in SQL. So let's leave this alone and pass in all 3 parameters and trust this will have a value, because it definitely should. So that's not really a trust, it's more of a it should. It will. So now we have updated the matchup, and we've updated, well, that's the wrong store procedure. That's why you check these things. That's why I hate the copy paste, because copy paste method, when I copy this whole thing here, I forgot to go all the way to the bottom and change everything. That's why I sometimes do the comment method, where I comment out every line and then just uncomment as I modify a line. That way, if I had done that, I would have seen, oops, haven't done this line yet. So I'm not a big fan of copy paste, and yet I use it a lot just because it is a huge time saver. But you have to be meticulous about making sure that you've changed everything. Use a system to help you. With that being said, I think that this is now done. We've now updated our matchup. Let's save that. We'll save the iData connector. We'll come back over to the code behind for our tournament viewer form. And we'll say global configuration, actually config, control dot, add the using statement, dot, connection, dot, and you look for the update matchup, and pass in our matchup. And we can look up above. Our matchup is M, but let's verify that. M is the matchup we're working on. Therefore, we pass in M. Now we have not yet implemented the text connector. Let's do that real quick, but not actually do anything with it. Just so we can run the SQL side of things and make sure that we have an updated value going through. Load tournament. Let's do uncanny losers first. Let's give them a 1 and say score. Note that if I do this, they're now off the list. Let's close this out. And actually have to close the entire application, because even if I were to reopen at this point, that model has been updated by our code. Therefore, it still has the newer values. The way I verify it's in the database is close all the way out, reopen, and then check to make sure those values are still there. Let's do that, and notice uncanny losers is marked 1-0 versus the bye week, and they have been marked as played. Now we don't yet have a matchup, which we're going to need to take care of that too, because this should say uncanny losers. We know at least half the team's coming through. So we'll take care of that in a minute. But we at least know we're saving to SQL. Now we could also verify by going to SQL and coming to our matchups. Let's go back to this right here, and we'll say run again. Now we have a winner of 2 for this entry. We have a score of 1 over here. So we've got data going in. That's great. But now we have to deal with the text connector side of things. We can't forget about that. Now again, here we have most of the code already. So let's go through and add the rest. So what are we going to put in here to actually save our matchup? Well, let's come over to our text connector processor first. That's where all of our code is that works on things like the matchup model. So I want to do a model dot update. So let's scroll down here. We have, this is a matchup model where we say save matchup to file. And that's actually really close to what we need. So let's actually take all the code inside here, and we're going to create a new method. Now, whenever you copy all the code or a big chunk of code, you should immediately think there's probably a better way of doing this. And there is. But in today's lesson, we're just going to make a similar method. It's not the same method, a similar method. We may come back and refactor this, or we may not. Here's the biggest takeaway you should get from this, though. It's more important to get your application running than it is to write really amazing code. Now, don't get me wrong. Amazing code is amazing. But it should not be at the expense of taking an extra day, 2 days, 3 days to get your application running. The other danger of writing amazing code is it's usually more complex, which means more debugging time. So I would rather see an application written with simple code that got the job done and got out the door, And then you said, okay, now it's time to refactor. And you saw if you could make that a little more powerful by crunching it down to one method, making different methods off of it, whatever you need to do. So that's my encouragement to you. I've said it before, I'll probably say it again, but better to ship than it is to have awesome code that never sees the light of day. All right, so I made a copy of all this code. I'm going to create a new public static void update matchup. What's this called? Save matchup to file, update matchup to file. That's a little bit of a weird name, but it matches the other pattern and you understand what it's doing. This matchup model, and we'll call it model. And up here we called it matchup. So let's actually keep those two comparable. That way when I paste my code in here, everything should still work the same. But we don't want to work entirely the same because, for example, this code right here is finding the ID to add to our matchup. We don't need that. But we also have this code right here which adds our matchup to the list, which is great except for one thing. And that is we already have a matchup in this list that matches our matchup. It just doesn't have the new information. We're doing an update here. So before we add our matchup to the matchups list, we have to take the other matchup out. So for each matchup model, M in matchups, if m.id equals matchup.id, so if the two have the same ID, then matchups.remove m. Now we're going to try that, but sometimes, and for good reason, sometimes when you change the list that you're looping on, it causes a problem. If that's the case, what we'll do, in fact, you know what? We're going to avoid the potential of being a problem. We're going to say matchup model, and this would be the old matchup. And then we'll say, instead of removing it, we'll say old matchup equals m. Why is that different? Well, we're just taking the matchup we find and putting that address into this instance. Then when we're done, we can say matchups.remove old matchup. Now it's going to yell at us and say it's unassigned. And the reason it says it's unassigned is because the only way it's assigned is if this is true at some point. It does not have to be true. Therefore, we have to say establish a new instance first and then override it. That way, if none of these in the for each, if none of them matched, then what would happen is we try to remove a new matchup, it wouldn't find any to remove, and that'd be the end of it. So now we add our matchup, and we should be good to go. The rest of this code should work except for this right here. Entry.save entry to file. We don't want to save our entries to file, we want to update them. Therefore, we will say update entry to file. We'll come down here to the save entry to file. We'll actually copy this entire thing so we even have a signature of the method name. And we're going to paste it down below. We'll call this update. And we don't need the file name passed in. We fixed that. So we can call it from the global context or global config. So now this is the same thing. So we'll follow the same pattern. We'll get rid of the ID check. We'll say matchup entry model. And we'll call this old entry equals new matchup entry model. For each matchup entry model E in entries if e.id equals old, not old entry, entry.id. If the two are the same, then old entry equals e. Then down below, we say entries.remove old entry. And now the original value for our matchup entry model is gone. And the rest of this is fine. It loops through, it updates the information, and it writes that to the config file or to the file. So therefore, we don't need to pass in the file name. We should be good now to call this update matchup to file. So we should be able to say model.update matchup to file. And that should be all there is to updating our information in a text file. Let's run this and find out. Whoops, we're still in SQL. So let's change this to be a text file. And run it again. We have the it might work tourney. Sounds good. We have two values. The worst team has a bye week. That's convenient. Let's score them. Let's first check this. Then we'll score them. And now they go off the list. Now it should be that was called, which means if I close all this out and start over again, the It Might Work tournament, the worst team has a value for a score of 1, and they are marked as complete. So now we've updated the text files as well. And that was pretty simple. There wasn't a whole lot to do there. That's great. But before we congratulate ourselves for being done, we need to realize that we're not done yet. We have one more thing we need to do. When I update a team and say score, they are marked as complete. That team then needs to be put into the next round. Fortunately, that's not too hard. Behind our score event, before we actually call the update, let's modify and actually let's call before the load matchups, just in case they also have changed the dropdown. Which I don't think they could, but just to be on the safe side. So what we'll do is we'll update the parent ID of the value. So it's a little hard to explain, but let's look at what our models say. This model says parent matchup ID. So it says this team, whoever they are, came from this parent matchup ID. Well, now we know what the parent matchup ID is. We can go find that because the current matchup, since it's scored, this becomes the parent. We go find where that parent matchup ID matches our current ID and say, okay, well, here's your team for that tournament or for that matchup. Let's see how this works. So what we're going to do is do a for each. We're going to loop through all of our matchups. Now, what are our matchups? We have a list at the very top of our tournament. Inside our tournament model has all the matchups. Remember those round of rounds? So therefore, we can go through each of those rounds. So list of matchup model, round in tournament.rounds. Then for each matchup model, M, nope, we can't do M because that's already being used up here. So let's call this RM for round matchup in round. So now we have each matchup. Now we say for each, it's one more for each, right? This is a matchup entry model. We'll call this me in rm.entries. Because don't forget that the matchup entry is what holds the parent matchup. Because each entry has a different parent. So now we can say if me.parentMatchup.id. Now we did have, I don't know if you noticed, we did have parent matchup ID. Now that's what comes from the database. Remember that the database doesn't load the object, it just loads the ID. We could rely on that ID still, except for one fact. If this hasn't pulled from a database, if it's pulled just from our object, which was just created, our tournament model object, if it pulled from that, then the parent matchup ID would be blank or 0. We can always trust, though, the parent matchup.id, because whenever we rehydrate the model, we always fill in the actual object. Therefore, we can trust this. It's the trustworthy one. So if that parent matchup.id equals our m.id, which is our current matchup ID, if those two are the same, then we have a match. And we can say me.teamCompeting equals m.winner. Since we marked one as a winner, we can put that team in the team competing in the next round. Before we go any further, though, we also have to update our matchup. To do that, we say update, but not RM, because that's a matchup entry. We update, not M, because M is our matchup. Instead, we say RM for round matchup, because this is the one we actually modify, the round matchup. So make sure you get that right. Don't put M, even though it would work, it wouldn't actually update the correct matchup. Therefore, you wouldn't see the parent being updated properly. So, with that being said, we don't need to modify SQL or the text connector because it's already in place. We already know everything we need to know. Now we can say start, go to It Might Work, load the tournament. Now we've already scored this, and we didn't mark it as mark the parent of the next round. So let's score it again. And we have an error. Let's pull that error message back up for a minute. I went away too quickly. It says object reference not set to an instance of an object. Remember me telling you that you'd see this message more and more once you start using class instances? Yep, you see it a lot. So I'm trying to access the parent matchup when a record doesn't have a parent matchup. Remember that every matchup doesn't have a parent. Round 1, there is no parent matchup that it came from. Therefore, I have to bypass this. So let's move it up one line. We'll do a surround with. We'll do an if statement. If me.parent matchup is not equal to null. Now, why is that okay to do? Because I'm skipping over this logic right here. Well, if you don't have a parent matchup, then you're obviously not going to match our ID. Therefore, we can safely skip you. Let's hit continue. Now let's go to round number 2 and notice that while a matchup has not yet been determined, we do have the worst team for team 1. If we come back over here to round 1 and say the best team versus the OK team, let's pretend the OK team wins. Now, in round 2, we have the worst team versus the OK team. So we've now been able to progress to the second round. Isn't that excellent? So there's nothing in round 1. Round 2 only has one game because we only have the one game to play. Now we're not going to deal yet with what happens when we win the last game, because that's once we get things set up a little more, then it'll come back and actually do the report and the celebration and all the rest of a person who wins. So let's save that for later, but for now, we know that everything is working for capturing this information. Just to verify, and it's always good to verify, let's come to program.cs, change this to SQL, just to make sure it doesn't work any differently with SQL. We'll grab our first tourney, we'll score the uncanny losers, and it says, oh, you can't do that. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. Let's find out why. The winner ID is null. Remember I said that we should always have a winner ID because we're scoring this. Actually, that was actually team competing ID. But we didn't check for winner ID. So why are we storing a record that doesn't have a winner ID? Matchup not yet determined. You see why we're not storing it? Because we don't have a winner yet for this matchup. But we do know now that one of the teams competing is the uncanny losers. Therefore, we don't store this information. We don't actually store it at all. So what we'll do is we'll actually move the cursor up here, wrap all of this in or surround with an if statement, and say if model.winner is not equal to null. Why? Well, if we're just updating the entries, we don't need to update the matchup as well. Therefore, we can skip over this section. We don't have to do it at all. Let's hit continue. And now it says, hey, wait a minute, object reference not set to an instance of an object. This is the one where I said, yeah, we'll always have it. I was wrong. So let's find out why. Well, if we're looking at this, the first one is uncanny losers in our model. I can zoom in here for you so you don't strain your eyes. But if we go to the second model entry, team competing is null. Well, that's kind of a bummer. So what do we do here? Well, we again surround with our if statement. But here, we actually need to move it all up here, and we'll surround this entire thing because we don't want to do the update if the team competing is null. Because if the team competing is null, it shouldn't have a score either. So therefore, surround with if statement. This is the way you test your code because it worked in text file and we didn't actually modify anything in the text file save to do this, do the update. Therefore, we thought, oh, it's going to work everywhere. Not so fast. So we still have some bugs in our logic, and that's okay. So if me.teamCompeting is not equal to null, because if the team competing is null, we don't have a team competing ID, and we don't have a score. Hit continue on that. And now if you go to round 2, we'll see that Uncanny Losers is in the first spot. Come back to round 1. Let's say that Sue wins big, 124-0. And now those two are updated, unplayed. There's nothing in the first round. Round number 2, it's Uncanny Losers versus Sue's team. So SQL now works the same as the text files, or at least has the same outcomes. And that's all there is to wiring up our last form. At this point, all the forms are done. Now our application isn't done. We've got a few things left to do. First of all, we need to go over all of our exception handling. Now you won't do everything necessarily in this whole application. We're going to pick out a few places where we have to put some exception handling in to more gracefully handle issues. The next big thing we need to do, and it's a pretty significant one, is we need to refactor our application. Our application is working, but now we need to go back through and make the code better, more efficient, and better at what it does. We also need to add the idea of prompting users. So we're going to send out emails whenever a team has been marked as ready to play a game. We're going to send out a blast and say, okay, here's your matchups. Tim's team is playing Sue's team, and let us know when you're complete. So we'll create those emails and send them out. And if you are one of the paid subscribers, we're also going to add in the idea of sending text messages to the user to say, hey, you're up and you're playing, Sue's team. So we'll do that as well. But then after we're done, at least the emailing, but also the texting if you're going to view that, then we'll come back and say, okay, now that when the tournament completes entirely, when all the games are done, then we're going to have some sort of system that emails out probably, or at least displays a message that says, hey, Sue won and beat everyone in the contest. And so for tournament XYZ, Sue is the winner. That will also be the place where we'll say, okay, Sue is in first place, therefore Sue gets X number of dollars. Or, however that works out for the prizes. So if Sue has first place and first place is marked as 50%, we'll calculate how much the entire tournament brought in and then say Sue gets half of that. So we'll do all that. So it's still quite a few steps to do, but really we're on the very tail end of this application. We're almost done. And now we're in the cleanup wrap-up phase. Welcome to lesson 24 in the C# from start to finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to refactor our application just a bit. Refactoring just means that we're going to rework our code so it does the same job, but in a better way. We've got some junk I want to get cleaned up in there, and now is the time to do it. Along the way, I want to improve a couple of areas that aren't quite up to standard yet. So let's get started. The first place I want to start is this iData connection. Remember at the beginning, we started passing back the same model we passed in. The thought process was, well, we updated the model, therefore let's pass it back. And that's just really not necessary because we already have the model's address. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start deleting things. I'm going to delete the return type and say void instead. And I'll copy that and paste over these other two. Now that's going to break both the SQL connector and the text connector because the signature line has changed. Remember that this signature line has to match what we have in each of our implementations. So for example, the iData connector will now yell at us. So let's change this to be void. And now we have a return model and it says, hey, you can't do that. No problem. We don't need to return it. Create prize model. We'll set that to void. Take away the return model. And take away this return model and set it to void as well. And that should take care of our interface. Let's go over to the text connector and do the exact same thing. So we're going to change this to be void and don't return the model. Change this to void, don't return the model. And then down here, create team as well. And don't return the model. And now it should be that, again, IDataConnector is satisfied with our new signatures. If you had just said control dot and implement the interface, it would have created 3 new methods, probably. I'm not positive. And actually, let's do this. Let's change team model back. Hit Control Z twice. And now let's see what it does when I try to implement the interface. Right down here, void IDataConnection.createTeam, and that's now the new method. So it created a new method for us. And it created it with a weird name, and that's because we have this issue up here where we already have a method called createTeam. And we can't have 2 methods called createTeam unless they have a different signature line. And the return type is not enough of a difference in signature for the system to tell them apart. Therefore, you can't have 2 with the same input type and different output types. So I just made one refactor. The refactor was I changed how these worked, and now I've changed my application. Now let's just make sure if we build a solution, let's see if anything fails, and it does. Down here in the create team form, if we go to the code, there should be an error in here somewhere, and of course there is. We have create person. Now it says, cannot implicitly convert type void to person model. Why is that? Well, because we're actually trying to take the output of create person and assign it back to P. We don't need to do that. Now let's build again. And now the build succeeded. So with just those few changes, we have eliminated what's really a nagging issue, the idea that we're returning something we don't need to return. So that's the first thing that I wanted to get taken care of. The next thing I want to get taken care of is in text connection, we have all of these string constants. Now remember that we don't need these anymore. Let's close all our documents. We don't need these anymore because in our global config, there they are. And now they're accessible across our entire application. Therefore, let's get rid of these. And now it's going to yell at us and say, hey, I don't know what people file is. Well, we say global config dot people file, it will now work. So we just add global config dot on the front of any file name that has broken, and we should be good to go. Now let's save to prizes file. We probably don't need to have access to this file. So let's hit F12 here. And note that it takes in the file name, but we don't really need that because we have the global config. So therefore, we're going to come back to that, make a note of it. We'll come back to that and make sure we don't ever pass in file names. So we'll come back to that later. But for now, we'll continue on modifying our file. And again, for now, we'll pass in those files, but we will refactor that as well. And this is a little bit of wasted effort, but I want to do this to make sure I clear all my errors out. because I really don't like changing multiple things at once, meaning we're changing the global over to global configs for the file names. That's fine. It's essentially one change. But we don't want to wander off doing other changes as well, like those taking the file names out of the method signatures. So let's just make a note of that. We'll come back to that once we're done all of this. Now it says tournament file does not exist. Well, that's because you have to have global config.tournament file. That takes care of that. And now if we do a build, we should be good. And the reason why I'm fairly confident we should be good is because those were private constants. Therefore, they should never have gone outside of this class. So now we can go over to the text connector processor and start taking care of these issues right here. Full file path, we pass in the file name. We're going to have to do that because that one is used for all the different files. So again, not going to change that one, not going to change this one. Load the file, whatever file it is. Not going to change that. But this right here, string people file name, don't need it. Now again, that may throw an error. And if it does, we can say people file, global config.people file, and that should now solve that problem. This one right here passes in 3 file names. We should be able to take care of all 3 of those and then just rename these. So team file, not team file name. Global config dot people file. And this will be prize file. All right, and that's yelling at us right now because there is no prize file. So let's look at global config real quick. We have the prizes file, it's plural. Now convert to team models only takes in, oops, we need to take out that sending the file name. And now that works. All right, so now we've modified all this code right here. Now saving to the prize file, we can take out the file name. Again, global config dot prizes file. Save people file. We can take that out. I want the modified code in here. Global config dot people file. Just make sure you get your file names correct when you are renaming these, because these are all called file name, which means you have to know based upon the method which file you need. If you're not sure, definitely double check. So we don't need those 2 file names. We don't need to pass in those file names. And we'll get to the matchup. It's down here, so we'll get there. These all look good. Matchup file and matchup entry file. We can get rid of those. We can get rid of the matchup entry file in the call. We're already using the global config down here for the matchup file. And we'll keep scrolling. Right now I'm just looking at the signatures of the methods. to find where I have a file name in use or I'm pulling a file name in. Once I change that, I look in here for any errors that pop up where I have to change that name. Like here, it was already taken care of. There's a matchup entry file name. So here's another one we need to change. And that looks like the last one we need to change. But note that we have a whole bunch of red squigglies over here. So let's find out why. The first one's actually up here. In here we have an error. I find the easiest way to find that is to go right to it, double-clicking it. And here we're passing in a file name. We don't need to. We can pin this list to make it a little easier. We don't need that. We don't need that. This error list updates in real time, which is great because we can see as we make changes if we increase or decrease our errors. In this case, we wanted to see errors because we're calling those files all over, calling those methods all over, and passing those file names in all over. And so if we didn't see errors, that would mean we had done something wrong. So definitely don't freak out if you see errors. We'll take care of all of those errors. And now it says we have no errors. Don't trust it though. Make sure you do a build. And it succeeded. So now I've moved all of those text connector, those files, whatever the text connection file name was, we moved all those constants over to the global config and made them public. So everyone has access to those same file names. Therefore, we've done that refactor. So now we've done two refactors, or two major ones. We have renamed all of our files over to be the new global config files. And we've updated all the methods that call those file names to now use the global config. And we've also modified our interface so that now it has the proper signatures without passing back those models that we didn't need to pass back in the first place. And we modified everywhere those are called so that we don't have a problem with calling them. So now we've done two major refactors, which is great. But now I want to move on to one more that I want to get done. And it's one that's been bugging me for a little bit. And if you've been paying attention to these videos, you'll probably know which one it is. If we come down here to our tournament viewer form and view code, and let's close out global config. If you come down to this event down here, and you can tell which one it is when you start scrolling. That event. That's too much code for an event. It's doing too much, and really, there's logic in here I want to pull out into a method because we'll call it more than once. So the action here is the score button underscore click. So whenever you score a matchup, we do a whole bunch of stuff. Now, some of this is user interface stuff. You'll always have this in your user interface. So checking which value to pull out, which things to update based upon where it is on the form. Those kind of things are all UI driven. So if this form were entirely different, then it'd have to pull from different locations for Team 1 score and Team 2 score. That's fine. And also the idea that we update the model with the scores. That's fine. Even determining the winner could be okay. But I really think even that logic needs to be pushed out of the user interface. Remember, the goal here is to create an application that, while it's complete as it is, our customer has said that the Windows form idea is great for now, But in the future, we're going to maybe want to put this on the web, or maybe have a WPF interface or something different. And so we don't want to have all the code in the user interface. It's not good anyways, but we want to push this into the library as much as possible so the UI just calls the library. Whatever it does, it just calls the library. And then the library takes care of everything else, including, do I call SQL or do I call the text file? Where do I put the stuff? How do I get it back out? How do I transform it? All that stuff is taken care of by the library so that the UI can just say, give me data. Now here's data back. And that's really all it should do in the user interface. So from line 201 down to the bottom, except for this line right here, the load matchup with a selected item. So everything else from 201 down to here, minus this line, all of this needs to get extracted into our class library, because this is all logic surrounding how to score the tournament matchup and how to promote the winner to the next round and how to mark the items as played. And so we're going to pass all of this off to another method. And we're going to put that method in the tournament logic. Now let's collapse these to definitions. So we have create rounds, create other rounds, create first round, number of bytes, find number of rounds, and randomize team order. These are all things that have to do with creating rounds right now for the tournament logic. Notice this was the only one that's public. We're going to add another public method in here that has to do with scoring the tournament. Public static void. Let's call this update tournament results. And we'll pass in the tournament, not logic, tournament model. So the job of this method is going to be to do everything here. So let's copy this code. Let's paste it in here. Come back over, and I will delete all the lines except for the one I indicated. And now we'll say tournament logic dot update tournament results, and we'll pass in our tournament model. And our tournament model is what? Let's scroll to the very top, and we see that it's called tournament. We're passing the entire model in, not just the matchup we're working on. And the reason we're doing that is because we're working on the entire object. All right, so now we've got a little bit of broken logic here. So let's take care of that. And then instead of tournament.rounds, it's model.rounds. And if you notice, we still have some broken logic even here because we're dealing with the M, which was our matchup, which we didn't pass in. That was a specific matchup we just worked on. So let's actually comment this section now as well. We don't need this line. That's for our UI. And this line right here is going to actually update our specific matchup, but we don't know what that is yet. So let's look at what this does first, and then we'll adjust this logic to fit into a class environment instead of working on one specific matchup. So the first thing that happens is we're scoring if we have a score to give. Meaning, if we have two scores, then we need to mark one of the people as a winner. Therefore, we can do the same thing, but against all of the matchups in our entire model. And here's the reason why. When we first created our model, some teams had a bye week. Well, when you have a bye week, you automatically win that game. And now there is no game. And we got around that so far by actually giving the person with a bye week a score, 1 or whatever it is. We gave it to them. And we actually said score. So now they have a score of 1 to 0 when they didn't do anything. And that seems kind of hacky. And so one of the times that I want to call this update tournament results is right after the tournament gets created. Because at that point, we'll know if we have any buys. If we have buys, then all of those should be scored right away. Therefore, we call this and say run through the entire tournament and score everybody. So we're going to do that. To loop through our entire tournament, we have to loop through all of our rounds, just like we did down here. And we'll actually do this for each loop more than once. So for each round in rounds, then we're going to loop through each matchup in the round. And here's what I want to do. I want to create a list of matchup model called toScore. And this is going to be the matchups where we need to score them. So, if, and this is where it's going to get a little tricky, so why don't you stick with me here. Normally down here, we did another for each on every matchup entry in our entries. And we said, okay, hey, if in this case the parent matchup is not null, then do this. But up here, all we care about is, do we have a score? So I'm going to do a little bit of link. So if rm.entries.any x equals greater than x dot score is greater than or less than 0. Actually, sorry, that was SQL. How about not equal 0? Much better. If any of the entries is not equal to 0, or rm.entries.count equals 1. Now what am I doing here? So the first thing I do is I check to see if any of the entries have a score that is not equal to 0. So if we have completed a match, then we've put the value for the two scores in. We're not accepting ties for tournaments. Therefore, one team at least has to have a score different than 0. It can be negative or it can be positive. It just can't both be 0. So if any, as in either, if any entry matches this pattern, if any entry can say, that's true for me, then we return a true. If none of them return this, but, there's our or, but the entries.count is 1, meaning we have a bye week. Remember, bye weeks don't get their own matchup entry. So if we have a bye week or we have a score, either way, we're going to add toScore.add rm. So we'll put them on the list. And if you notice I have a bug here, and it's saying, hey, I can't do that. Cannot convert to this other signature. That's because that's an any, not add. Control J, A, D, D. There we go. So now I've added that matchup to my list that need to be scored. When this entire thing is complete, I will know which ones need to be scored. But there is one flaw here. And that flaw is that if we have a score, we may have already scored them, where we said this is the winner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if rm, let's give a little space here, rm dot winner is not equal to null, and I'll put this in parens. So if winner is equal to null, So if winner is null, meaning we have not yet assigned a winner, and either one of their scores is not equal to 0, or there's only one entry. So if we have already scored them, we're going to ignore the rest of this stuff. So if the winner is not equal to null, if it's filled in, then the whole thing is going to fail no matter what. We'll skip over. And that just prevents any kind of issues we have with scoring the same winner over and over again. So now you've done all of this. Now down here we have a list of matchup model that we need to actually score. Now we can actually score these by looping through with our logic down here, where you say, okay, if this score or that score, how do you mark the winner? But I don't want to do that here. Instead, I'm going to call a private method. And so I'm going to call that private method, let's call it score matchups. We'll pass in a list of matchup model. And we'll call those models. I'm actually creating a signature line, which that's not what I'm supposed to do. So I'll copy that for later. And I'll pass in instead my toScore. Sometimes I think 3 steps ahead and forget what I'm doing right there. All right, so down here, I'm going to create that private static, and it's a void, private static void score matchups. And now in here, I'm going to do essentially this logic. I'm going to say essentially because there's some tweaks to it I want to get done. And the first tweak I want to make is we said that if one score is greater than the other, that determined that the first score is the winner. So the one's greater than. But in golf, the lesser score wins. The score is lower. And at first you said, well, we're just going to deal with greater than for now. But now I'd like to go back and actually add that in since we're working on it right now. So what I'm going to do is actually go to my app.config and add a new key here. We already have one for our data. Oops. So I'll paste that in there. And instead of file path, it's going to be winner determination. And I will say that the initial value is greater. So this is saying that the score that's greater is the one that's going to be the winner. If I said lesser, it would be the score that is the lesser, the lower one. Now, you may be saying to yourself, now wait a minute, that means that our entire application can only do one direction for scoring, greater or less than. And that's true, but we are extracting the logic out into here. The next step would be to actually modify our model and store this information in the database. Then we could store it in the tournament model setup. We could say greater than or less than, or high score wins, low score wins, and pass it in that way. And then we could just change it from pulling from the app config to change it to pull from the tournament model. So that gets us pretty close. I'm not going to go into actually adding it to the tournament model just because we'd have to change a lot of different places. We need to change our text files, our SQL data structure, our store procedures, and some of our code. So that's a pretty big change to do, and I really don't want to get into that and take up too much of our time. When we've seen how to do it, it's just a matter of doing it. So instead, I'm just going to put it here. That gets us all the new logic for greater than or less than, and then wherever you pull it from is up to you. So in our app.config, I have winner determination, the value is greater, and that's just a key string. So how do we pull this winner determination? We already have the logic for that if we go back over to our text connector, this full file path, if we hit F12, there is the code for pulling that value. It's actually right here. So we can take this code, come back over here, and say string score direction equals, but instead of the file path, we want to pull in the winner determination. And so I can't find a configuration manager, I hit Control dot, add the using statement, and now we're good to go. And so the values here should be greater or lesser. Now, using magic strings is always a little bit concerning. So there's a couple things we could do. One, instead of saying greater or lesser, we could say 1 or -1. But that gets kind of confused with Boolean. We could do a Boolean and say greater wins, and then we have a true or false value. And what I would do for that is I would say 1 or 0, since this is a string. And I kind of like that a little better. That way, greater wins is either 1 or a 0. It's either true or false. And so what we'll say is that if it's 0, it's false. Otherwise, whatever it is, it's true. That way, by default, it will be greater. All right. So we're going to say greater wins. We'll call the same name as our actual app setting. Now we're going to say is, we're going to do an if statement here. If greater wins equals 0. And it can't be 0, it's got to be 0 inside of a string. There we go. So 0 means false or low score wins. So we'll start with a low score first, because that way we'll do an else statement down here. And now this is for 1 means true or high score wins. And so that just flips the bit for us to say 1 or 0. The key here is I said 0 equals 0. The only way to say low score wins is to have this be 0. Any other value, anything, we'll set it to be high score wins. And since that's what the majority of games do, then we're going to go ahead and set that way. We'll set the default to be the one that is most likely true. Now what we're going to do is take this logic now and put it in each of these sections. So, if, and here's the problem now, is we have a list of matchup, not one particular matchup. So before we go any further, let's wrap this entire thing to a surround with for each. So we'll say the for each is matchup model. And the value, let's call this M. In, my tabs don't work for some reason this time. That's okay. For M in models. All right, so now we can say if, this is going to loop through every time for every matchup where we have to mark a winner. And so we're going to say if M dot, and if we continue on this, we'd say entries, and the first one and the score is greater than m.entries.1.score. And actually, they should be less than, because it's a low score wins. Then in here, following this logic down here, we would say m.winner equals m.entries 0.teamcompeting. So if the first entry, if its score is lower than the second entry score, the winner is the first entry's team. Now, have you seen the flaw in our logic yet? This will only work if we have 2 entries. What about bye weeks? Well, that's where we need to have a separate case for the bye week. Now, we could wrap this entire thing in another if statement, but that gets kind of tedious going that many layers deep into loops and ifs and all the rest. So instead what I'm going to do is say if m dot entries dot count is less than, let's just say equals 1. That we're absolutely sure what we're doing. If we have one entry, let's put a note up here. I don't do a ton of code comments, but I do comment when things are a little tricky or when I want to give an example of what's going on. So in this case, this is for bye week. So in a bye week, what we'll do is say m.winner equals m.entries 0. Dot team competing. All right. So we take the first entry, since it's a bye week, therefore they're automatically scored as the winner. The problem is now I'm still going to go through and hit this next if statement, unless I do continue. And continue's job is to continue this for each at the next iteration. Think of it kind of like a break, but it doesn't exit entirely. So a break in this situation would say, okay, the for each is done. Go on down here. The continue says this loop, this particular iteration is done. Go on to the next one. So that works for us. So now we check for bye. Then down here we check to see if we have, if team number 0 was the winner. And then we could either check, just say that the other team is the winner, if that's what we're going to say, or we could say that we don't do ties. Now, down here we did the else if because of ties. And I think I like that logic still. I don't like the idea of allowing a tie through with one team advancing. And so in that case, I'm going to go ahead and actually do the same logic. We'll just need to deal with what to do if there is a problem. So else if, and we'll continue on in the same logic. We'll just copy and paste this and change around the numbers. Now we could change, and that's not 2, it's 0. We could change this symbol, which would be quicker, but if we're matching patterns, then you'll see that the pattern is the team in front is the winner. The team in front is the winner. Just makes it a little easier for looking at things, in my opinion. And that's up to you. So now we have this else statement. And what do we do here? Well, we really shouldn't go any further in saving this data. I really think that we should be done at this point and say, you know what? No, we're complete. We can't go any further until you handle your business. So we should do a throw new exception. I'm going to type out exception. Here's what I do. There's a number of different exceptions that Microsoft provides. And the great thing is they're pretty descriptive in their names. So for example, unauthorized access exception. Can you guess what that's for? Probably for accessing something you don't have access to. And so what I do is I scroll through here and say, does anything really match the issue I'm having that I'm throwing an error for. And so I'll scroll up here. I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time on this because really it is up to you. You're the one capturing it. We could say it's a format exception if we want. We could even throw just an exception if we find that there's not really a value or an exception type that matches up exactly with what you want. Array type mismatch, argument out of range, null, argument exception. But that's usually for methods. Application exception, a non-fatal error. Well, that's kind of it, but let's just do exception. Notice we have 3 overloads here. We can pass in nothing, a message, or a message and inner exception. Let's just pass in a message and say, we do not allow ties in this application. Now you could say to yourself, well, wait a minute, what if we had 2 zeros? Well, that would never be matched as a completed entry because at least one of those values has to be a non-zero in order to even get into this list. So now we've handled the one type. That's all of this, but only for the lower score wins. So now we can do when the high score wins. We can copy the same logic, paste it down below, and now we change the signs. And that way it's still the same team that goes through, but now it's because this score is greater than this score. So that's the same logic. Now we've marked the winner for every single matchup. And let's, instead of score matchup, let's call this mark winners in matchups. We can come up here and change that call. So we've marked the winners for the matchups. Now what we need to do is go through and actually update the parents then for the next round. So you've won the first round. Now you get moved into the second round, if there is one. So move advance winners. And we'll leave it at that. We'll pass in that same list. Let's call it right here. Private static void advance winners. List of matchup model called models. And now in here, we're going to do this logic. So we're going to loop through every round in our rounds. And we're going to say, okay, we got to find every matchup in every round. And inside there, every matchup entry. And say if your parent matchup is not null, and it matches this m.id. Well, that would be the model, one model in this list of models. So we'll need to put another loop on the outside of this that loops through every model and does all of this. So it should actually be pretty simple because we should say surround with for each, and we'll say matchup model, and we'll call it M in models. Now I called it M specifically because I knew that down in here we had called our matchup M. Therefore, all this code should work. The only thing we have a problem with is this model.rounds. And that's actually the tournament itself. We have to pass the tournament in here. So let's do that. So I'll say tournament model, tournament. And instead of model here, I'll say tournament.rounds. Now up here, we have to pass in our tournament model. And now we've again satisfied that signature. So now we've looped through every matchup and said for every matchup, look through every round and every matchup in every round and find every entry in every matchup. And if the parent matchup is not null, check to see if it matches the current model we're on, the matchup model. If that ID matches, that's where the winner advances to. Now don't forget, this is a curated list of models. This is only the matchup models that have been marked as we need to score them. Therefore, they have been all been given a winner. Therefore, by this point, we know that every single one of them knows who their winner is, so we can put that winner into the team competing of the next round. And note down here that we save the matchup itself. And the reason it saves the matchup, notice as the RM here, which is a matchup model, not just the matchup entry, is because this save for matchup also saves the matchup entries inside of it. It does both jobs. So that's all good. And so really, we're done with this logic. We're able to port it over just by adding this for each here. But up here, we still have this one line. And that one line is to update the matchup. Remember, M was the matchup where we're scoring. Well, down here we did all the scoring, but we never actually saved the matchup. And I think the logical place to do that is when you mark a matchup winner. Because if something is marked as winner, we should probably save it. The only question I have, though, is for these throw new exceptions. Imagine a scenario where somehow you passed in a tie of 1. We shouldn't, the friend shouldn't allow it, but say it did. We get to this point, we score, say, 3 entries, 3 matchups, and they all score fine. The 4th one we get to, it goes, yeah, tie. Throw no exception. Well, that means that we don't do anything after that. We crash the application back to the UI and say, hey, there's a problem. Well, in that case, we will have saved some winners to the database and marked them as having a winner. The problem with that is when we try and find the matchups we need to score, we look to make sure the winner is null. So we'll have items marked with a winner of not null, and yet their parent, or their child, the second round, won't have the team competing because it was never passed through, because that comes after we mark the winners. Therefore, I think what I'd like to do is I would like to instead update the matchup for each of my list in the toScore after I advance the winners. At that point, I know everything is set. I can mark these as having winners. So let's do that right here. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different just to show you can do it. One way you could do it would be a for each right here. Do a for each on the score and say for each item in the score, run this global config.connection.update matchup. But there's an easier or at least shorter way of doing it. We can say toScore dot for each. We'll say x equals greater than global config.connection.update matchup x. In that one line, I've done this line for every one of the items in the list of matchup model toScore. So how does that work? Well, it's just a for each. It's really all it is. And it's really just a function that's shortened down. So instead of declaring all of that syntax for each item in list, do this code, we have shortened it down to, here's the variable name in the for each, here's the code to do. That's it. So that line is functionally equivalent to saying for each matchup model X in toScore global config dot connection dot update model X. This one right here is the same as this one right there. This one just takes out all this stuff that it really doesn't need to have. It knows it's doing a for each, therefore it says, I can do a var here. I don't care about the type because I can figure that out. So I don't need that. And it says, you've already told me which one to search through, so I don't need that. That's right here. It's an extension method of that. And you've already told me for each, so I don't need that. I don't need the curly braces because I can just do it in a one line. That's cool. And so it says, okay, I don't need the semicolon either. There. That's all I need. So, X into code. Done. And now we can call this method from anywhere at any time to update our tournament results. For example, in here, we have a tournament model being created. At the very end of this, after the first round is created with the buys, if there are any, we can say update tournament results model. And now we've updated that tournament to make sure that any buys are moved into the next round. And then also behind our form, we can call that as well, which we've already done. So now let's start this again. And instead of loading a tournament, let's create one. And we'll call this testing tourney. Entry fee of 10. Team first place, Uncanny Losers, and Sue's team. That sounds great. We'll set no prizes for this one. We'll create the tournament. Notice nothing happened. That's because we didn't actually wire this button up to do anything yet. It creates a tournament, but it doesn't actually go anywhere from here. We need to fix that. So let's actually fix that before we go any further. So we'll close out everything. Come down to our UI. Go to our Create Tournament form. At the button, we have to do something now. And this is where we need to do the same thing that we do on our dashboard. When we call, let's just open it up so you can see it, Load Tournament button. We're going to do the same code right here. So I actually copied that, and then I pasted it in. Now we already have a tournament model. We don't need to load that. So we create a new tournament viewer form, pass in TM, which is our tournament model, show that, and then we'll also say this.close. So now it should be that this form closes after it opens the tournament viewer form. Let's try this out. So notice we have our testing tourney. We'll try one more though, just to make sure we have this part of it working. Entry fee of 10. Add our teams. This is called another test. Let's create our tournament. Notice it closed and this window opened. Tournament, another test. And now we have two teams here. Let's check for the ones that are unplayed. Notice that even though team first place was here, and it's a bye, if we check the unplayed only, they go away because they're already marked as having played that game. And if we come to round 2, we'll notice that this one's not marked yet, but it's team first place versus team first place. That doesn't seem right. So now we've got to figure out why that is. Let's first score this. Actually, let's not change anything right yet. Instead, let's look at the data. So we're using SQL. So let's first go look at our teams. Let's just do a query window here instead. Makes it a little easier. I wish the query windows would start with a whole bunch of lines already in them, because I don't like the idea of having to go down below and put more lines, especially since if you have no lines in, let's just cut this out for a minute, and I say select star from, and I want to highlight this, I can't come down below or go above. It's messy. And so I like to paste in a whole bunch of lines, or put in a whole bunch of lines, so I can just click down here and up here and put stuff where I want them. Select star from dbo.teams. Let's just see what that has to hold for us. We have 3 teams, that's great. Now let's look at the tournaments. So there's our another test. That's great. It's active. Now let's look at our matchups for this tournament, tournament number 4. So matchups where tournament ID, not entries, tournament ID equals 4. And we have 3 entries. We don't have a winner marked in any of them, which is interesting because we do have a bye week in here. So let's figure out what's going on there. So let's look at matchup entries. And matchup entries links based off of matchup ID. So let's look at those matchup IDs again. It's 10, 11, and 12. Where matchup entry between 10 and 12. And that's yelling at me because it's not the right column. So it's matchup ID. Matchup ID. So the matchup ID is between 10 and 12. Give me those values. So if you notice down here, the parent matchup kind of gives it away. This is the second round. So in this case, the second round, the parent matchup is 10 and 11. And the team competing is 1 for both of those. That's interesting. That doesn't seem right. It seems like we should have that to be null for team competing until we mark a winner. And don't forget, let's run both of these. We don't have any winners marked for any of them. Therefore, how can we say that one is the winner versus the other? So team competing in this first matchup is number 1. And that's the one getting passed through to the second round for both matchups. So we're going to kind of trace this down in our application, but it seems like we're writing bad data, and some of our logic we just didn't quite work. So let's close this out. And let's go over to our tournament logic and actually start right here when we're updating our tournament results based upon the newly created tournament. So let's start this again. Let's say create tournament. I'll call this the debug tourney. We'll say the entry fee is 13. We'll add 3 teams. We'll say create tournament. Now here you have our tournament model. Let's zoom in on it and say, okay, what are the values here? We have 3 entered teams. That's good. Sue's team, Uncanny Losers, and team first place. Note you can also pin this over here. Kind of makes it a little easier because then it's always over here. Next, let's inspect these rounds. So the first round has 2 matchups in it. The second matchup, and I go down the bottom one first so I can go up, and it just works a little better with the UI here. But the second matchup is Team First Place versus Uncanny Losers. Matchup round is 1. Notice the matchup ID is 0. We haven't actually saved this to the database yet. That's going to be kind of interesting because we're down below, we're saving information to the database. And so that, I think, is going to be a problem. So we have, round 0. The first one, we have 2 entries. Again, matchup ID, or the ID is 0. So therefore, we've got some problems to deal with before we can even get to the team ID is correct. Before we can even get to anything else, we have to deal with the fact this isn't saved yet. So we called this at the wrong spot because that record isn't saved yet. And if it's not saved yet, then we can't update it. Because we're updating stuff that just doesn't work. So let's go back to where we started from, the Create Tournament form, double click on our button here, go all the way through until we see the Create Tournament. And this should actually save our tournament. Note that over here in the tournament logic, that's not what we're calling here. We're calling the global config.connection.create tournament. That's where the actual update happens. It calls the tournament logic. Therefore, what we can do is after we create the tournament, now we can update our tournament results. Now it's going to yell at us and say, no, you can't do that. And that's because we haven't added the using statement, or we don't have access to that value outside of the tournament logic. We have to say tournament logic dot. And now we can pass in our tournament model. And I think that should work. And I'm pretty happy with it, but not totally satisfied. And the reason why is I shouldn't have to say, okay, now that you created a tournament, now update it. The UI shouldn't really care. So I'm still not in love with this. I'm going to cut it back out and go over to the Create Tournament, which is actually in 2 different spots. Over here, let's look for Create Tournament. Now here's the call for saving the tournament, the prizes, the entries, and the rounds. Now we can pass this in, and it's again model. And here, this way, we are saving everything and then updating those bye weeks. So that feels more natural. But don't forget, over in Text Connector, we also have a Create Tournament. And once we save it to the text file, we then paste it in. And again, it's called model, so we're good to go. So now let's test this one more time, and hopefully this time we'll have squashed those bugs. It's always important to test what you're doing. This one's probably broken. Another test, because that's when we had that issue in the code. But let's create a new one anyway. We'll call this one Logic Fixed. We'll say $14 entry fee. We'll add our 3 teams. We'll create our tournament. And now it pops up with our tournament. If we check this, we only get the second game because the first one is a bye. In round 2, we've not yet determined, but team first place is in the first slot because team first place was the one that had the bye. Therefore, if we mark this one as Uncanny Losers wins, now there's no unplayed for round 1, and round 2 is team first place versus Uncanny Losers. Excellent. And now not only do we refactor our code to put it in the right spot, take it out of the UI and put it into our class library, we also made some tweaks to it so that it did the job a little better and it handled things a little more intelligently. And so that's part of the refactoring. Part of refactoring is just making your code run smoother or look smoother in the way you lay it out. But part of it is also rewriting how you do things to do them better, or to handle more edge cases, or to fix problems that would otherwise pop up. So those are the two parts of refactoring we need to do. And in this case, we've done both of those. Now, there's probably a lot more I could do in this application in order to refactor it to be even better. But those are the big ones that I want to tackle today. I want to tackle cleaning up some of that stuff that was just kind of leftovers, the mess we created when we first started, when we changed our logic. And I also wanted to tackle that one area where bi-weeks weren't being handled properly, and we had extra code in our front end that really should have been in our back end in the class library. Welcome to lesson 25 in the C# from start to finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to add in some basic error handling to our application. So let's just jump right in. Here we have our tournament viewer form. We just finished working on this a few videos ago. Now we know that in our last video, we said that if a score was tied and we hit score, it'd throw an exception. But let's see that in action first before we go any further. So let's load up our testing tourney. And here we can see the uncanny losers versus team first place. Let's give them both a score of 1. If I hit score, I get this error message right here. If the user were running this application not in Visual Studio, but actually as the exe, then what would happen is the application would throw an error message and then crash when they close the error message. So that's not good, but notice it says, we do not allow ties in this application. That's my message. That was from when we said throw new exception, we do not allow ties in this application. So at least it passes our information along if we want to use it. So there's a couple things we could do. One, in the code behind for our score button right here, we could say, well, inside here, the score button is where that error happens. What some people will do is take all this code and do a surround with try catch and say, I have error handling. You don't. And you have horrible error handling if you even pretend to say it's error handling. Usually it's more like error eating and no clue why things are having errors, but I'm just going to surround the entire thing with a try catch and hope that fixes the problem. Remember I said that if your application fails in unexpected ways, it should fail spectacularly. If you're not expecting certain data, unless the user gave it to you, and you think it has to be in a certain format and it's not, you should just crash right there. You shouldn't go any further. So I am a big proponent of saying, no, shut the application down. But when we know there may be an issue that is caused by the user, there's things we can do. The first thing you can do is right here is where that error might be thrown. So I could right click on this, just this line, and say surround with, and say try. And that puts this line of code inside the try catch block. And then for exception, here's the other thing people don't do. Let's give it a name. Don't just have just exception here, actually give a name. And the reason why is then we can do something with it. Now, note this throw here. What this will do is by default, it will throw the exception or continue to throw the exception after we have completed this try catch. That way, we can catch the exception in multiple spots if we want to. But we're in the user interface, we don't want to catch it. Also note that it's not doing a throw EX. That's bad. Don't do that. Don't put the variable name in afterwards. That actually destroys important information about the exception. So don't do that. But in our case, we're going to catch this exception. And we're just going to say messagebox.show, and we'll say the application had the following error. And we'll say, I have to put my $sign in front of this. ex.message. And we could make that a red X in the for the icon and all the rest, but we're just going to put just the message for now. So now when we run this, let's run again. We'll say testing tourney, load tournament, select our team, our matchup, put 1 for each value, and now it says the application has the following error. We do not allow ties in the application. Now if I go back to that matchup, it still has the scores, but they aren't saved in the database. And that's pretty good. And I'm going to leave that try catch on there because I do want to catch any kind of errors that come through from saving to the database. But I don't think we should get that far. And this is one of my main tenets of application development is you never trust the user. The user will give you bad information all the time. They really will. So right now we're saying, I trust you, put a number in there. Well, why? Why are we trusting them? We should trust but verify. And so in the score button, before we go any further, I'm going to call a private method. Say if is valid data, that's a method. If it's not is valid data, therefore I'm going to put the exclamation point in front and say message box dot show you need to enter valid data before we can score this matchup. Okay, so this method right here is valid data. We're going to say private bool is valid data. And I'll create an output, a bool output, equals, and we'll start it off with true. Normally I'd initialize this to false, but again, it's much easier to set a value to false many times than it is to say, is everything correct? And if so, make it true. So we're going to start off with true, and if anything goes wrong, it will always be flipped to false. Now, what do we need to check? Well, we need to check to see if team1's score value.text is a number, a double, and also the same for team2. So let's do something very similar to what we did here. We'll create 2 variables, and then we will do this entry right here, and then we'll do this entry right here. And we'll say, instead of score valid, we'll say score1 valid and score2 valid. So now what we're doing is we are grabbing team1 score value.text and team2 score value.text, and we're capturing if these are valid doubles. So now, if score1 valid, I'm going to say if not score1 valid, and I'll actually make this really simple by saying or not score2 valid, then output equals false. Then down below, I'm going to say if team1 score equals 0 and team2 score equals 0, that means they're both 0. And why are we scoring something if they're both a 0 value? Can't do that. So output equals false. And then if team1 score equals team 2 score. Now we could have collapsed these two into one, because if they're both 0, then they're equal to each other as well. But I like the idea of separating it out because it could log something differently in each of these cases. So we could say for team 1 score equals team 2 score, output equals false. And then return output. So that would work. And now it's going to pass back a true or false. If it's valid, it passes back a true. If it's invalid, it passes back a false. But let's get a little more descriptive. And let's first run this, just to show you it does work. I want to improve it next, but first let's run this. And so here's our team. We're going to say, leave it at 0. You need to enter valid data. Okay. So I'm going to say it's both of them are 1. You need to enter valid data. Okay. And it says, oops, we do not allow ties in this application. That's interesting. So now we have tried and it got through. And the reason why is we didn't say down here, return. So that was our bad. My bad. So let's run again. And this time we're going to give it something even worse. We're going to say hi and yo. You need to enter valid data. Excellent. So it's not actually doing anything then with these values. And in fact, those values didn't even get stored inside of the model. So that's good, but that message is kind of annoying me. You need to enter valid data before we can score the matchup. That's great, but it's really generic. Why? What's invalid about it? So instead of having this be a bool, let's make it a string. Oops, not string output, return output. And we'll start this string off as an empty string. And then instead of saying false, we'll actually put a message in here that says the score 1 value is not a valid number. Now, why just score 1? Well, we're actually going to make this into 2 if statements. That way I can say the score 2 value is not a valid number. Down here, I can say you did not enter a score for either team. And then finally, we do not allow ties in this application. I forgot my punctuation up here as well. So now, instead of saying not is valid, we can say, and we should say instead of validate data, or is valid data, we should say validate data. And now we can say validate data string error message equals validate data. And now if error message dot length is greater than 0. So that's my upgrade. So now we're going to capture the message that comes back. If the message is an empty string, we have encountered no errors. If it's not an empty string, then we can, instead of having this, we can actually have a more targeted message. We can say input error, colon, and then have our error. So now we run this. We have a number of options for what could go wrong, and each one gets its own message. We do not allow ties in this application. That's interesting. So let's find out why that is. Well, if you notice,